You might have seen the headlines were filled with the strange and unsettling story of a woman who allegedly poisoned her ex-husband with mushroom-laced beef Wellington. It was a reminder of just how powerful and sometimes deadly fungi can be. But for me, mushrooms spark a very different feeling. In windy, impenetrable forest, where I've spent several years studying mountain gorillas, one of my favorite pastimes has been photographing the incredible variety of mushrooms that you find anywhere from on rotten wood to growing out of elephant dung. They're beautiful, mysterious, and essential to life in the forest. But there's another side to fungi, not just the ones that can be put into recipes and kill you. They can shape our lives, our health, and even the survival of other species. Today, I'm thrilled to talk with Emily Monosson, whose book Blight digs deep into the world of fungi. Welcome to Wild Connection, the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Vertelen. I'm a scientist and author that studies animal behavior. I'm passionate about animals and exploring the complexity of their lives, their intelligence, relationships, families, social connections, and emotions. I also love helping people reconnect with nature to live better lives. This podcast is about you, other animals, and how we're all connected in this wild and crazy thing called life. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Wild Connection, the podcast. This episode is really exciting because I am interviewing environmental toxicologist and author Emily Monosson, whose recent book, Blight, Fungi, is it fungi or fungi?
It's any way you want to say it.
Fungi and the coming pandemic. So, Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You know, I think, gosh, there's so much to talk about. And I love your book. And I know you have several books. So I hope that listeners at the end of this podcast will do a little digging and find out some of your other exciting books. But before we talk about Blight and what that is, I'd like to orient the audience a little bit to who you are, how you chose to become an environmental toxicologist, and why you write about some of the topics that you write about.
Okay, well, I couldn't really tell you why I became an environmental toxicologist. I think I was always interested in sort of human physiology and what happens to stuff in our bodies. And I wanted to go into public health in the beginning. And I think way back when I did that, which was well over 30 years ago, there weren't really that many toxicology programs. And I was also fascinated by harmful chemicals as a kid. Like back when I was a kid, underneath the sink, there was a lot of nasty stuff stored, and I would play with those.
Oh, gosh.
I'm lucky that we used to play mad scientist, and I'm lucky that we didn't mess ourselves. But so I had this, this interest in the two things. And when I was looking at grad schools, I started out in actually microbiology because that was the thing that was that would impact people, that was in water and in the environment. I didn't know any better. And half a year into studying microbiology, I had to take a couple of toxicology courses. And that's sort of when I fell in love with, I realized that there's actually this thing called toxicology, which is not the case today because everybody knows about forensic toxicologists from all those TV shows.
Right.
Which is not what I do. That's just a tiny part of toxicology. So from there, I just ended up, first I was studying sort of more along a pharmacology track, because that's a big part of toxicology. Then I really wanted to get outside and work in environmental toxicology. So I could switch from, we were doing basically human oriented stuff, to fish. And so I did several years working on the effects of environmental chemicals like polychlorinated biphenyls that were in water on reproduction of fish. And then not a straight career path, had kids and wanted to work part-time and had to figure out how to make that work. So that led to a whole bunch of different things, including writing consulting reports. And I realized that one of the things that I love doing is putting information together, just, synthesis of information. And that's always what I loved. I like doing that in my dissertation. That kind of led to writing more because you can, look, you can just sit there. It's such a luxury, I think, as you probably know, to sit and read.
Yeah.
About what you're interested in. And we don't always get to do that when you're doing lab work or you're busy doing other kinds of, science in a different way. So anyway, I got to do that and just put it together in ways that I thought was interesting. And the first book that I actually had any kind of involvement was editing a book of essays by women scientists. And that was called Motherhood, the Elephant Laboratory. And doing that book, which was, I actually was having a hard time with my own career because I was thinking, what did I do? I started working part-time. That kind of directed me into different kind of science, doing science in a different way. I don't know if you want to hear all this.
I do. And I also think it's really important. And as a woman scientist myself, I'm sitting here, people can't see me, but I'm nodding, going, yeah, okay, keep going. Yeah, this is an important part of the story of how we do science and the ways that we have to make decisions about a field that sometimes tries to force you into one lane. And this is what I also find so fascinating and interesting about your story and what you're sharing is that, I've also taken the scenic route. I also love different topics. And I also, I love doing meta-analyses, like that, where I get to synthesize a lot of information. And sometimes in, I'm going to use the word traditional, thought that scientists or the field has is you're supposed to just focus on one thing all the time. And what I, think is so wonderful about your work and your books is that you can pull together all of these different perspectives and it's more integrative. And by thinking about things that maybe you didn't personally study in the field, you bring a different perspective and you bring a lens that just makes it so much more interesting. So, yes.
Yeah. Well, that's so when I went with the Motherhood book, I had kind of reached out in like broadcast on a listserv I was on, just that, I was having a hard time figuring out my career and it wasn't falling into traditional pathways. And so I started hearing from lots of women, like I had 17 pages of emails or something. And so at that point, it seemed like it would be good to sort of spread that word and explore this further. And one of the things I did when I was doing that book, though, was that I actually did, if there was any bias in it, it was that it came time to collect essays and figure out which ones would be in the book. And I was more focused on those that were not in academia because I was really looking for, so it was called Motherhood, the Elephant. All of these women they were PhDs, they were mothers, but that really, to me, that wasn't necessarily the sort of heart of the book. It was the different ways that we do science, as you just mentioned. It was the non-traditional career track. It just happens to be that a lot of those women at the time are the ones that were falling into that non-traditional career track. But I think now there's a lot more people that are taking that way, and it's not always easy. And it's not, and so that's what interested me most about that book, was trying to think about what is success in science? What does that even mean? How do you, is there a definition for that? And also just what it means to the larger community to have people who are trained in the sciences doing all sorts of different things instead of just in our academia, towers. Like I was just talking to a friend who said, I'm going to vote for so-and-so because they're the one scientist running for, I don't remember, it's Congress or Senate. And they're like, can you believe there isn't another, and so it's these sorts of things of just having people on the playground or importantly in politics or writing books or just communicating science. We need that. It's so important.
Yeah.
So anyway.
I agree. And so when you created that first book, the editing those essays, did that sort of spark for you this passion for writing?
Yeah. So what I realized from doing that, so it was a couple-year project. I really enjoyed doing it. Although I'm not sure I was really in a position to be kind of an editor of people's essays, which I tried to edit very lightly because I never took an English. If I didn't have to take an English course through college, I didn't take it. So I'm not trained in English. And that's one thing that I wish I had paid. When I talk to young scientists today, I would encourage them to maybe take an English course or learn how to write. And I do think that's a part of a lot of programs today anyway, because communication's such a big thing. But learning how to write, I don't even know how to say good or well. I mean,
right. How about learning how to write creative nonfiction is a skill that everyone should learn.
You did that very artfully.
Well, I had to too, because I was trained in the formal, now even publishing a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, they want a story. They want it to be a story. And you're like, okay, let's now, thank goodness I wrote 2 books. I can do that better now and as well. But I agree with you. I think that a lot of people might not realize how much writing is in science. And it's not just, I'm a big believer in those that want to and those that have the talent for it, which you clearly do. We need scientists to be the front face to the public in a way that resonates and translates information to people. That's really important. And your book, Blight, is one of those, because I think I don't think that people pay a lot of attention to a fungus unless it's a mushroom on their plate. I guess I want to orient people to what is a fungus, because it's more than the mushroom on your plate.
So fungi are amazing. I mean, they're their own kingdom. And I would say that for people who are interested in fungi in general and not the pathogenic kind, that Entangled Life, I think it's called, Merlin Sheldrake's book, is a great place to go. So because that really, those kinds of books introduce you to fungi in the role that they are most important in, which is as the decomposers in our world and as linking other species together. And so there are millions of different species of fungi. I think, depending on who you read, you get a different answer on how many there actually are. I don't think anyone really knows. And I think that we only know about a small proportion of those fungi. And of those, I write about like the smallest proportion, which is the disease-causing fungi, the pathogens. So most of them are just important in our world in many different ways. And they are, cellularly, they are different. So, for a time they were grouped with plants, like, centuries ago, people thought they were more like plants because you look at mushrooms and they kind of look like plants and they come in different colors, but they're not plants, and they're actually more closely related to animals cellularly and evolutionarily. And so so there's different kinds of cell types. There's bacterial cells, there's plant cells, and there's animal cells, and we are eukaryotes, and fungi are eukaryotes. And so that means that we share our cell type is more like fungal cell types than they are like bacterial cell types. And that becomes important when you're talking about pathogens, which we can talk about later, or talk about now, but up to you.
Yeah. Well, and so I remember that, that mushrooms are more animal-like than plant-like, or fungi are more animal-like than plant-like. But there's also, when I hear the word blight, I always think about agricultural crops, or, and I know that in the book you cover way more than that, but why is it termed blight? I was just kind of curious about that. Like, where did that originate from as a descriptor?
Okay, so as you probably know, when you're writing a book, you got to kind of have a title to pull it all, something in your head that is driving your conception of the book. And I think for me, so when we think about blight, when I was starting to do this book, there was this new pathogen up the East Coast that was affecting tomato plants, and it was called late blight. And that is actually an organism that's fungus-like. It's an oomycete, so it's not a fungus, but it acts like a fungus, and it's always thrown in with fungi, even at fungal meetings about fungal pathogens. So late blight was this disease that came up the East Coast and actually just totally destroyed our tomato plants. They'd look great, beautiful, healthy one day, and overnight they'd just be wilty and brown. So I think that word blight to me came from that. That was about when I started writing this, because I realized sort of the devastation something like that could cause, not just to our backyard crops, but to local tomato growers. They were losing their crops large scale. And that blight is actually, it was the same organism. It's called Phytophthora infestans. And it's the same organism that caused the potatoes to die in Ireland, that contributed to the Great Irish Potato Famine. So that, I think that's probably where blight, my shorthand for, okay, I'm going to look at fungal pathogens like this, even though it's not a fungal pathogen, that are causing these devastating diseases. And so that's really where, for me, the blight came from. And I think you're right. It's often associated with agriculture, but it seemed like a good shorthand for a fungal pathogen that was highly destructive.
Yes. And I know it's been used historically to describe that. And I think that you talk about a lot of trees that we've lost, like the chestnut, as a result of fungal pathogens. But because you brought up Ireland, I now want to circle around to, how do you think these types of fungal infections that have devastated crops or impacted agriculture have shaped our social and cultural evolution? Because that potato famine spawned an emigration, right, out of Ireland. And so are there other examples where you kind of came across how much, aside from the practical devastation on the plant, and we'll talk about animals in a little bit, really also trickled out into influencing our social organization or our cultural, landscape?
Yeah, that's a good question. I could say that the chestnut blight, so also chestnut blight, so that I think probably had a large impact on people living in the Appalachian Mountain region, which is where most of those big old chestnuts were, and they relied on. So the American chestnut tree was a really important tree along the East Coast up until it got wiped out about 100 years ago. I think that's one thing that was both important socially, culturally, and ecologically, to all those animals that relied on chestnuts along with people. I think probably I would say agriculture, and I'm, this part I'm not an expert on those sort of, downstream impacts, but I would also say that, they have large impact on people who are working in the fields, because when there are these kinds of diseases, there's greater use of fungicides. And so that's important. And that was something that I wrote about, fungus that has caused a problem in banana plantations it began back in the first round was in the 30s or 40s. And because of that, they were using large amounts of fungicides. And so that obviously impacted the people who were working the crops. And especially back then, there weren't a lot of regulations. And I think it was not a good thing by any means. And even today, crops like bananas use a lot of fungicide just because there are so many fungal pathogens.
Well, and I was really keen on your discussion of bananas and plantains because, living and working in Uganda, where I study mountain gorillas, many people there grow, they have banana, small plots like on their, just their land. And I don't know. I think there's a resurgence of a fungal pathogen that's impacting bananas today, and it's spreading in different countries. I don't know if it's in sub-Saharan Africa, but is there, I know we're jumping around where my mind was going, but how much does diversity of, strains of different crops protect against something like a fungal pathogen? And are there bananas that are resistant or more able to survive exposure to, and I believe it's a soil pathogen.
Yeah.
Right.
So there are two major pathogens as far as I know. So I'm also, preface this by saying I'm only an expert in none of this.
Me neither.
I know a little bit about what I wrote about. My understanding is that there are two important fungal pathogens in bananas. One impacts the banana that are called the dessert bananas, which are probably not the most important bananas that people are growing in their backyards. These are the commercialized bananas that are growing in large crops around the world, but probably not the backyard bananas that people are eating.
Right.
Those are called the Cavendish bananas. They're the bananas that we buy in our supermarket. And that's the one that I was referring to, that back in the 40s, 50s, there was a fungus that impacted those bananas. At the time, they were growing a totally different strain of banana called the Gros Michel, or however you say it in French.
Okay.
And that banana was, it got to the point where they couldn't grow that banana anymore because the fungus was wiping it out. And so what they did was someone discovered that the Cavendish banana, totally different kind of banana, was resistant to that fungus. And so they swapped it out and they started planting the Cavendish bananas in those, huge plantations that exist for growing the export bananas. And that worked pretty well for a long time. And it's like replacing one thing with another. It didn't change how they grew bananas. They still grew them in these huge monocrop plantations, which is, I think if you ask people who are in agriculture, let's say that's just inviting disease. Sure. I think we all know that. And so what happened is that more recently, so the first one was called TR1, first go around, and now there's a fungus called TR4. I think they're oxysporum fungi that is impacting crops now around the world. And so there's really a lot of fear in the banana growers that this is going to, they won't be able to grow the Cavendish bananas again, which is why you see those headlines that say, we'll have no bananas. And so when I spoke to the people who are working in that area, their take is that, well, first of all, we need to diversify the kinds of bananas that we eat. There are a lot of different kinds of strains of bananas. Why not have bananas like we have apples? We have lots of different kinds of apples. Bananas, you can't really eat, if you think about your bananas, you look, there aren't really seeds. You see what's remnants of what would have been a seed. So they're not an easily breedable fruit. So that's one of the things, is that they can't just go with all the other things I wrote about the plants. They're trying to breed, strains or cultivars that are resistant, but you can't do that with banana. The other fungus, so that seems to only affect those dessert bananas, those TR1, TR4. When I mentioned that there's a lot of fungicide used in the banana industry, it's because, and that's a soil-borne fungus. And one of the problems with that soil-borne fungus, because in the soil, it can also form these spores that can last decades. So once you get it in your plantation, you're done for in that plantation. You can't, try to grow it again even a couple of years later, because it's going to be sitting there in the soil just waiting. So that's one of the things that makes fungal pathogens, also certain fungal pathogens, particularly difficult. Mm-hmm. So there's another one that's actually a leaf that settles onto the leaves and grows in the leaves, and that's called black sigatoka or yellow sigatoka, and that's a different fungus. And that one actually affects, I think, a lot of different kinds of bananas, but it's manageable because people who are growing those bananas, if they get the leaves off, if they do good husbandry or management, use good hygiene, use good hygiene, then they can kind of manage that disease, and possibly with some fungicides, they can, that's manageable. So that one is also an important problem because it affects, I think, most species, or a lot of different species of banana.
Okay. Well, what caught my attention about that was the type of fungus when I was reading Blight, called Fusarium. I think it's Fusarium.
Fusarium.
Fusarium. Okay, sorry, I'm not pronouncing it right.
Fusarium. I think yes.
And that's the soil one, right?
Yes.
Yes. So I have a soil fungus story.
Oh.
Which took me by surprise. And it was a Fusarium. So I'm sure there are many types. Yep. But having, and they're common, like these are common soil fungi that are all over the world. when I was working in Uganda last year, I got a parasite, which is not a fungus, but I got a parasite in my toe. And that had to be excavated, is the only word I know how to say, which left a big gaping hole in my toe for a while. And then a few months later, my toe swelled up again. And I was now here in the US. And I thought, maybe the parasite had babies. Because that's possible. I don't know. Right. And maybe it just took them a while to grow. I'm coming around to the soil fungus in a moment. So I go to a podiatrist and using very highly technical iPhone with a flashlight, pointed it at my toe and said, goodness, I don't see anything. And I was like, I don't know if you could with an iPhone. But and so then she said, well, do you want me to cut it open? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, maybe, because something's clearly not okay. We obviously can't see it with the iPhone flashlight. Like, maybe we got to dig a little deeper. So they indeed did slice my toe open. And I, thinking it was a parasite, said, hey, maybe we should just pour some, iodine in there, like betadine. That'll kill the parasite. Turns out it also kills fungus, which is really important when we think about where we might catch fungi in hospitals and, So long story short, when the pathology report came back, it was negative for everything except fusarium.
Oh.
In the tissue. So now I did not expect that. That was a complete surprise. And the way I was informed was, well, it's not a death sentence. That was the literal language that came out of the podiatrist's mouth. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? And she said, well, this fungus, it's very common. It's a soil fungus. But if you were immunocompromised and it got in your tissue, there's really nothing we can do.
Wow.
And I was like, thank goodness I had you put betadine in, because I had already thought, well, I already knew that, because I was doing lab work, I knew if I don't want to contaminate certain samples with fungi, you have to clean with betadine. Ethanol won't work,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Betadine, iodine is essentially a natural fungicide. And so then I ended up being referred to infectious disease. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this, like, am I going to lose the toe? Like, what? Because I didn't have a sense of how serious potential fungal pathogens can be for humans. And this is where I'm leading us with this very long story. Needless to say, the infectious disease doctor said, well, your toe looks great and don't let it slow you down. And I was like, I didn't even know that I should think of it that way. So up to now, my toe is fine and I seem to be fine. But it was shocking to me that the idea that a small soil fungus could lead multiple doctors to be like, thank goodness you're alive. And so what are we seeing in terms of how, because people think about antibiotic resistance, but they don't think about fungi. So what are we seeing in terms of the human population experiencing a higher than normal sort of occurrence of fungal infections that are really hard to treat?
Yeah. So first, I'm curious, do they know that have you cleared that fungus, or are they just like, stay healthy and as long as it doesn't bother you, we'll figure it's just going to be there?
The infectious disease doctor said, your toe looks good, so don't let it slow you down. If you have any further problems, contact us. So my toe has not acted in any weird way. I'm not immunocompromised. So like, for example, if I had HIV, I probably would have died, by now, or be so infected with a fungus but that was kind of terrifying, because I also have tested positive for yellow fever, living in the Southwest. I never had any symptoms, but my titers were positive. I also know yellow fever, not yellow fever.
You mean valley fever?
Valley fever. Sorry, I'm confusing yellow fever, valley fever, which is a fungus.
Right.
it impacts dogs and people. And that's on the rise.
Yeah.
And so we always hear about, antibiotic resistance and, C. diff or certain bacterial infections that are becoming harder and harder to treat. But I think people are shocked. I was about what?
Yeah.
I can have a small fungus in my toe, not even in the toenail. It wasn't the toenail fungus. It was in the tissue. And that could kill me?
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, so as you mentioned, one of the issues is being immunocompromised. So in general, there's a reason, most of the focus probably for a long time has been on bacteria and viruses. And that is because, at least according to the scientists that, I read and spoke to, is that we have some very good protections against most fungal pathogens or fungi in general. Like that one might not have even been a pathogen. It was just a fungus that could live in you. And that is that most fungi do not like our warm body temperatures. So that's number one that sort of helps keep a lot of fungi from just growing on us, because they are just degraders. They're trying to make a living. And if they can find a place to settle in and eat, they'll do that. But they can't do that for the most part on us or in us. So the second thing that we have is we've got, well-developed mammalian immune responses. And so that's a big protection against fungal pathogens. And so when our immune system is compromised, then, we're losing one large part of our defense against fungal pathogens. This is something that has been a growing sort of, and the third thing is just also that we use a lot of antibiotics to treat other things. Like you get an infection, you get antibiotics, and antibiotics, so within us, we all have fungi in us. We have yeasts, we have some other kinds of fungi that are just part of our microbial flora inside on us. And that community keeps they all keep each other in check. That's what I'm trying to say. You've got a community. And so when you wipe out the bacteria because you're taking antibiotics, it gives the fungi an opportunity to overgrow. So when people get yeast infections, because, when they're taking antibiotics, that's part of the reason why. So that's another reason. And, there was some interesting quote from the 50s that I found that was talking about how the rise of fungal pathogens around that time, they called sort of a disease of the antibiotic era. Because prior to the 50s and then prior to the rise of HIV, I spoke to one infectious disease doc who specialized in fungal pathogens, and he was like, he went to med school, I think in the 70s, and he said, if you had a systemic fungal disease in someone, you would go to rounds with that. Like that was really interesting because there just weren't that many cases like that. And so HIV, which destroyed people's, ability to respond, immune response, is one of the things that sort of was an opportunity for fungal opportunists. So a lot of them are called opportunistic infections. They'll take advantage. But then we also, we had a lot of other advances in medicine. So that's a virus that, impacted the immune system. But then we, through our medications and helping keep people alive and doing things like tissue transplants, all those things require some cancer treatments. They inadvertently or intentionally suppress your immune system. So we have a large proportion of the population who are living today because of these advances, but they're living with compromised immune systems. And I think we all became more aware of this than ever before with COVID. I think, when people were saying, well, if you're immune compromised, it's much more important that we all protect them from COVID. So, there's a large section of our population who are now more susceptible to things like fungal infections because of their immunocompromise. And the other thing that has happened that I wrote, so as an example for a rising fungal pathogen or an emergent human fungal pathogen, I wrote about a yeast called Candida auris. And it's a yeast. It's something that I think it emerged around 2016, a little bit before that. And when I was just starting to write this book, the CDC came out with a notice to healthcare providers to be on the lookout for Candida auris because it was alarming them. And the reason it was alarming to them is because it was a yeast. They were finding it in people who were immunocompromised or compromised in some way. They were in long-term care facilities and, in the hospital for a long time. Those were the people who were being impacted by this fungus. It was very hard to treat. It had a high mortality rate of upwards of like 60%. And it seemed to have emerged around the world at the same time. So it popped up on several different continents at the same time. And so that's unlike COVID, where you could trace it back to a point of origin. And so that suggested to public health workers that this yeast was probably out there in the environment, just doing its thing. And for some reason, it became better able to live in human bodies. And so that has led some to hypothesize that it might be something like climate change. So as the general environment gets warmer, maybe this fungus was living happily at 97 degrees. And as it, temperatures just became warmer in its environment, slowly evolved to tolerate warmer and warmer temperatures and eventually our body temperature. And so now it's become a problem. And the last thing that was important about that fungus was that when it emerged, it was also resistant to a lot of antifungals. And we don't so there's only, I think, maybe 4 different classes of antifungals that you can treat somebody with, compared to like over a dozen antibacterial drugs. So I think we all know there probably isn't anybody hasn't been treated with one antibacterial and then they need to go to another or perhaps even another because your bacterial infection was resistant. So when this happens with fungi, they don't have that many options. So that's another problem that makes fungal pathogens really important. And so what was really curious about this was that these fungi, when they emerged, were already resistant. And that's sort of a mystery. Nobody knows why, but it made it harder to treat. It's still harder to treat.
Yeah. So. Well, and what was sort of terrifying for me about that example was, I think you, well, I know you wrote about it, but I'm not sure where in the story, but there was a person in the hospital who died and the entire room was covered in spores. It was everywhere. It was on the bed. It was on the walls. It was on the, right. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think, and are mold and mildew considered fungus?
Yeah, so mold and mildew those are all fungi. I would say this was a yeast, and so I don't know if people would say they were spores or yeast.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm not using the right terminology.
The yeast was everywhere in the room. That's true. In the very beginning, when this came out, they were finding that they couldn't treat it. You were talking about, treating things with betadine that kills it. Right. But they were treating it with when they were cleaning up a room, they would use what they were normally using for however long to clean up bacterial and viral pathogens out of it, to sterilize or clean up a hospital room. And that wasn't working for this.
Right.
And so that was the other thing that was different about this was that fungi are usually we're used to thinking about pathogens as transmissible. I mean, we all learned that one, right? How transmissible they are with a cough or a sneeze or your nose dripping or whatever.
Right.
And fungi are usually not like that. They spread by spores. They spread, we don't spread them one person to another, but this one was spreading from patient to patient, probably surface wise or on, hospital equipment, things like that. Right. That's one thing that they learned since then. That was in the beginning. And when I spoke to some, a scientist at CDC, he said, well, that was right when that started, but then we've figured out how to, do better hygiene in hospital rooms and to prevent this from spreading. But when COVID happened, so that was before COVID, and then COVID happened, and then all the attention came to how to control the virus. Meanwhile, the fungus was still there, and it was an opportunity for that, some of that hygiene that had been practiced to stop the fungus wasn't practiced anymore. Yeah. And it turns out that throughout the COVID pandemic, this Candida auris has spread and become even more of a problem.
Yeah.
And it was also, talk about compromised people when people had COVID and they were having problems, lungs were being compromised in the beginning. And so that was also another sort of canvas for that fungus to invade and take hold.
Well, and, this kind of raises the question, about what is it about fungi that makes them so resilient? Is there something about their physiology? Is there something about their structure? I mean, that makes them just so resilient or resistant to, or difficult to control or manage? Is there something about them,
That's a good question. So that I would love to hear a physician in agriculture, like someone in agriculture, talk about that, because I think there's probably two different. That's probably two different realms. So in the human, fungi, as far as I know, can be difficult in part because when I mentioned the cell thing, that we have the same kind of cell types. And one of the reasons that there probably aren't a lot of antifungal medications is because those that we have are very toxic.
Yeah.
So when you make it antibacterial, bacterial cells types are very different than ours and they have different features. And you make a chemical that will attack those features that we don't have. So it will kill the bacterial cells, then leave ours alone, which is why a lot of antibacterial biotics are pretty safe. But with antifungal medications, if you're attacking, a part of a fungal cell, well, we've got the same thing. So that's one reason why can be difficult to get rid of them is just that the medications can be harsh and hard to use. But the other, like I said, there just aren't that many options. Probably where and how they grow in the body, my guess is partly important. So that's humans. But in the environment, one of the things is that they're making spores and they're spreading their spores everywhere. And like I mentioned with the banana, some of those spores, there's certain kinds of spores that can last decades. But if they're not lasting decades, they can last years. And they can spread really far on air currents or just on tire.
Right. Or shoes.
Shoes, tires. So in agriculture, that's a problem, is that you've got, I spoke to one scientist who worked with wheat who just talked about, I can't remember how many trillions of spores that might be over a wheat field. So you can't treat that.
Right.
And when you've got the spores that are, living for a long time, you kind of screwed.
Yeah.
Once they take hold.
I think since COVID, people became more aware of how easily things can be transported in a global world. But I don't think people really consider how we move funguses around. And there's been some pretty significant consequences now, maybe for us as well, but for other species. And two that you cover in depth, which was, at the same time, a delight for me to know that it's being discussed and shared more widely, even if the outcomes are not great, is on bats, the white-nosed bat syndrome, and the chytrid, is it chytrid fungus? Chytrid fungus in amphibians in particular. So I wanted to just talk about this a little bit, and I think I'll take bats because a lot of people, have perhaps a negative perception of bats. We always think of them as, they spread viruses like COVID or Narberg or Marburg or rabies and things like that, even though they are super important ecologically. And you talk about the little brown bat in the book. And so what has been going on with North American bats? Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, European bats have this fungus around, but it doesn't impact them the same way, which is super interesting. So could you talk a little bit about white-nosed bat syndrome, what we know, who it's impacting, and why? Do we have an answer for why?
Yeah. So white nose is something that it's a fungus that emerged around in the 2000s and started impacting white nose bats here in the New York area, Vermont area first, as far as anyone can tell. And it's a fungus that has killed bats now by the millions, and it's spread from the East Coast across the country. So it's an ongoing pandemic in bats, North American bats. I wrote about little round bat, but it impacts other kinds of bats. And the bats that it is impacting are all hibernating bats. So the bats that will be in a cave over winter when it's cold. So one of the interesting things about this fungus is that it is a fungus that's particularly cold loving. And so it actually likes low temperatures. So what scientists now understand is that it's a fungus that will colonize the bats while they're hibernating in their caves. And when the bats do that, so bats normally have very high body temperatures. They're flying mammals. I mean,
Right.
they run hot. But, in the winter when they're hibernating, they will match the temperature of their caves, pretty much their body temperature. And that allows this cold-loving fungus to colonize them and eat their skin, is basically what it's doing and growing on them. And I don't know that there's even yet that there's a really good understanding of how this fungus is killing bats. What happened in the beginning was that they would find these dead bats in the early spring. They would find bats that weren't hibernating like they should be. They were flying around. And then, they would just find dead bats by the millions come spring. But there were always a few survivors, but not many. And what exactly the fungus was doing, besides just it would, eat holes through the membranous skin in their wings, colonize their face where there was skin, so accessible skin. They don't know if it was sort of waking them out of torpor, out of their hibernations, that they're burning through the fuel that they normally put away for winter. And each time they wake up, they're burning more fuel than they should be. They don't know if that was the cause or how exactly it does how exactly they're dying. But they are. One of the questions is always, where did it come from? And so using genetics, they've been able to trace this fungus back to Europe. And as you mentioned, they see bats, and when they look at old museum samples, they also find this fungus on European bats, but they're living with it. So it's unclear if those are hibernating bats still. I don't know, but the thought is that, and they can find this fungus in bat caves in Europe, and so the idea is that probably the bats were infected with it at some point, co-evolved to be able to, survive and maybe change their behavior. I don't know exactly. I don't know if anyone knows exactly how that happened, but it happened. And that somebody, cavers, probably brought that fungus from those caves where those bats were to the caves here. And so that's how we got it here. One of the sort of optimistic, hopeful things is that now, so that was 2000, so we're 20 years out, and scientists are starting to find that slowly some bat populations seem to be either recovering or they're just not getting wiped out the way they were before. And the question is, why is that? And so some of those studies have shown that those bats seem to manage their fat differently, or maybe they're putting on more fat. There was one study that was sort of called the fat bat study, and the survivors seemed to be heavier than the ones that didn't survive. And then there was a genetic study that sort of confirmed that same thing, that maybe there's a change in sort of either fat metabolism, or maybe it's a behavioral change. Maybe they're eating more, maybe they are better feeders. Maybe they have different behavior during hibernation and they're not waking up as much. I think that's unclear, but there's some hope that bats with that characteristic, and maybe some others seem to be surviving. And so they're hoping that there'll be some sort of, contemporary evolution or rapid evolution of the bat populations, and they will survive.
And so that's hopeful, whereas for many amphibians, I think there's not as much hope, because I think some species have already gone extinct from the chytrid fungus, which I don't know. I can't remember, all the details, but my understanding was that that fungus came from I think it was sub-Saharan Africa, on frogs, African clawed frogs. Okay.
That was one story, but I think in the end, I tracked it back to Asia, somewhere in Asia.
Oh, okay. But was it from the pet trade, from the illegal?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's how it moved into different areas, was through the pet trade. Okay.
Yeah.
What's interesting, right, is that these kinds of things have been impacting wildlife species for a while, for 20 years. And now we're starting to see, the reason you called it fungi and the coming pandemic is because, I think we might be at the tip of the iceberg of what we could be experiencing in the future. And wondering how much so climate change might be creating evolution in fungi to tolerate warmer temperatures, but I'm also wondering how much of, we've heard about permafrost melting and ancient bacteria and ancient viruses. And I'm like, what about some ancient fungi? Or do we have any information about sort of trapped fungal, if they can survive, right, for decades or even centuries?
That is a good question. I have not seen that yet.
Okay.
But one of the things that is also happening is that the range of, so you probably see this with valley fever. I think there's some concerns. That's a fungus that actually seems to be impacting healthy people. So those that get valley fever, which is a lung infection, you can probably speak more to that than I can, but it's a lung infection, and it can be very bad. And it was mostly in the desert Southwest, but there's concerns that with climate change, it might, spread and enlargen its current territory. So it will be more of a problem in more places.
Yeah. And what I don't know, even for myself, I think many people, I think about 30% of people get symptoms. The rest are sort of asymptomatic, but then that, I think since the titers were positive, that means that it's there.
Yeah,
and so I don't know if I ever needed treatment for something that suppressed my immune system, low enough, if it would activate or provide an opportunity for that to start to produce symptoms for me or not. I actually have no idea. I was quite surprised because
was it titers for the fungus or for antibodies against
for
the
antibodies?
Fungus?
Yeah.
Oh, so maybe, don't know, maybe you're exposed but don't have.
Yeah, I don't really know, right? I didn't get a lot of information. But I think that I wonder what we'll do, because as you mentioned, right, we do have some ability to either develop vaccines or antibodies or antibiotics to bacterial vaccines for and prophylactics for viral infections, but fungi, the pathogenic, infectious, opportunistic ones, range changes, melting of permafrost, who knows what it can release. So has writing this book changed anything about what you do in your day-to-day life, like what you discovered or uncovered? How has it impacted you?
I take off every little diseased leaf on my tomatoes that I see them. And I pay more attention to the mud on my boots when I like to hike a lot. And if I go somewhere, I pay more attention to, I try to at least clean the bottom of my boots before I, set foot somewhere else that's far away.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I think I would be more aware. There are many stories since I wrote this and, of people who had undiagnosed lung things. Mm-hmm. And, I think one of the things that when I spoke to the ID doc, it's that a lot of physicians aren't thinking fungus first. And so, if any of that happened, I might ask, how about fungus?
Right.
Because I have heard of people who have had long-term lung things, and finally they're diagnosed with aspergillus or something, which is a very common fungus that you usually don't get unless you have space in your lung or immunocompromised. So that sort of thing. But other than that, these are hard things to write about because there's not a whole lot that everybody can do in their day-to-day life. A lot of it is policy, regulation, high level things to really get changes.
Well, and some of those changes, some of those high level policy things in the past were to implement import-export regulations. Yeah. It's why, when I come back into the U.S., did you have any fruits or vegetables with you?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's why countries like Iceland, are very strict about when you bring out an animal, you can never bring it back in. Bringing in animals, I mean, it's just And this is one of those things that you can do. And yet here we are with, a global spread of Candida auris, and other opportunistic pathogens. So I don't know how you look at a surface and don't go, "Oh, I don't know what's on there."
Well, but like you said, so we are breathing tens of thousands. We're all breathing fungal spores. We all have throughout our life, and most of them are not going to cause a problem. So
yeah, it's true.
I do also. I am more aware of aspergillus, which is one of those things that grows in your compost heap when turning compost, and you see this puff of what I can only imagine are spores coming out sometimes. I don't breathe that.
Oh, that's a really good point, right? I mean, so do you just use a mask?
Hold my breath and look away. Through COVID, I became a very good breath holder.
Good breath holder. Excellent. Okay. Yeah. I mean, or you can just put on an N95, I guess, when you're turning your compost.
I could, but it's like you go down there and you don't expect to be doing that, and then you do it, and then right. And I'm probably fooling myself because there's so many spores that, sure, you couldn't possibly hold your breath that long for them to all be gone.
Right. Well, gosh, Emily, thank you so much for being on the show. This was really fascinating. And I think that, now I keep saying to myself, there's a fungus among us. And I know that's, a silly joke that whenever I ask students to leave me a joke on an exam, it's either like, he was a fun guy, or there. That's a common one that I would get. So, thank you for taking the time. And where can listeners find your book and other books? Do you have a website? Are you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn.
Okay.
But I would say through the publishers is probably a good place, or your independent bookstore would be able to get them. So I'm a big fan of independent bookstores. So yes, you could just ask them and they can order it if you were interested.
Great. And the publisher is Norton, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
My conversation with Emily reminded me that our relationship with nature is far more entangled than we often feel comfortable admitting. Whether it's the fungi beneath our feet, the wildlife we share space with, or the ecosystems that sustain all of us, human and other animal alike, our decisions have an impact in profound and unexpected ways. That interconnectedness is at the heart of this podcast and our very wild connection. In the next episode, I'll continue exploring these bonds with author Tamra Dean, whose book Shelter and Storm, At Home in the Driftless, invites us to consider what it truly means to live in relationship with a place. I hope you'll join me for that journey. In the meantime, if you're enjoying the podcast, please give it a like and share it with your friends. The more people we get listening, the more likely I am to be able to continue to bring you these incredible people to talk about all of these wonderful and beautiful and sometimes challenging topics. Thanks for listening.